We just got some new information about the Star Wars series, which never was. All that and more discussed on today's video. Hey guys, this is Justin. Hello and welcome to another video. So if you're like me, you're probably familiar with Rick McCallum, not only because of the important role he played in creating the Star Wars prequels, but because he was in so many documentaries, whether for the special edition or whatever else, and before YouTube and shows like the Clone Wars. If you were a Star Wars fan with a VHS player, or if you were lucky, an early DVD player, your options were limited. Rick, who's now left Lucasfilm, of course, was a major cog in Star Wars during the 90s and 2000s, and he recently gave an interview on the Young Indy Chroniclers podcast. First of all, I didn't know the podcast existed before this week, but it's a cool idea. For those who don't know, the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles was an Indiana Jones show in the early 90s. The podcast obviously is looking at the show in great detail. Rick McCallum first started working with George Lucas on Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, then moved on to other projects including Star Wars. The podcast is mostly devoted to the aforementioned show. However, towards the end, Rick McCallum also talks about Star Wars Underworld. First of all, I highly recommend listening to the entire episode. It's a fun look at just a pretty neat era of Lucasfilm in general, but while the podcast has posted bits about Star Wars Underworld on their YouTube channel, the entire discussion is over 15 minutes long. Again, full credit to the podcast, I'll link to it down below, but what did we learn? Well, as a bit of background, Star Wars Underworld was Lucas's idea for a live-action Star Wars TV show. As the title suggests, it would have been set in the heart of the Coruscant Underworld, and would have had a much darker tone than most of what Star Wars had been up to that point. It was set between episodes 3 and 4, and while it wasn't supposed to be about any of the main characters of the universe, they may have appeared. Rick discusses this in the podcast, but arguably Star Wars Underworld's most defining feature is its ambition. George Lucas wanted to go big, he wanted to make essentially mini movies in a television format, and that was partially why the show never got off the ground. So what did we learn in this podcast? What did Rick have to share with us and the podcasters over at the Young Indy Chroniclers? Well, a lot of interesting information, including how the show failed to launch and how things, if they'd went slightly differently, could have completely changed the trajectory of Star Wars, not just in universe, but as a brand. So, Rick explains that Star Wars Underworld was actually fairly far in development. They had scripts, he says 60, I don't know if he means exactly 60 or around 60. Either way, they were complete, they were supposed to be extremely dark, and they would have, according to him, put the universe on its head. They had scripts, they had a showrunner, they had ideas. He says when looking at the show, it would have cost about $40 million an episode to produce, which is wild. In the full version of the podcast, he compares Band of Brothers, which was about $20 million per episode. Rings of Power is apparently $58 million per episode, so that would be the modern comparison. But with inflation, that's still actually less than what Rick McCallum figured the show would cost, and the big difference is that Rick, George, and Lucasfilm were operating in a much different world. George is and was rich, but he wasn't rich enough to bankroll that show on his own, so as Rick explains, they were looking for partners, and I feel like George gets really excited, gets maybe even fixated on things, and in order to get Star Wars Underworld done, Rick explains that they were going to throw in whatever necessary, including future Star Wars movies. Basically, you bankroll my incredibly expensive series and I'll make you a Star Wars movie. And the partner Lucas seemed most likely to work with is the one fans are always asking for, HBO. However, what some would call a twist of fate ended up preventing the partnership. Rick explains that the night before HBO and Lucas were set to meet to discuss a potential partnership on the show, their contact at HBO ended up being caught up in some sort of scandal. I hadn't heard of this, which isn't surprising surprising. I mean, I was a teenager at the time, but yeah, in May of 2007, Chris Albrecht, who was an executive at HBO, largely responsible for The Sopranos, Sex and the City, and other major hits of that era, was arrested in Las Vegas on suspicion of assaulting his girlfriend. It's really interesting to think about the potential alternate universe here of if this meeting goes through and Star Wars works with HBO. I'm going to just read a bit of an article from the LA Times about Chris's arrest. The firing casts a pall over the cable channel, which makes about $1.2 billion a year and is one of the most profitable units of Time Warner Inc. Under Albrecht's direction, HBO not only minted money, but also produced programs that left a lasting mark on American culture. The upheaval comes at a time when HBO is uncharacteristically vulnerable, with no blockbuster to replace The Sopranos now in its last season. It's really interesting to think about HBO in the middle of their golden era of TV doubling down on what would have been the largest TV project ever with Star Wars Underworld. Unfortunately, Rick explains that the new executives at HBO who took over afterwards weren't interested, and for a time did focus on smaller scale projects before we saw, for example, Game of Thrones. Anyway, what else did we learn? Well, Rick still has the scripts. Technically, Disney owns them. There's no chance they'll be ever made into anything. He says they're too dark, which may be true. I suspect some elements may have been incorporated into other Disney shows, but it's also pretty clear that it just is not in line with their current programming, not from a tonal perspective, just the way they make shows. It sucks because it still sort of feels like we haven't had a true live-action Star Wars show, and Star Wars Underworld would have been that. Longer seasons, a show that understands what a show is in terms of structure. But I mean, what would it have been about? That's the question. George Lucas really loved bounty hunters. There would have been bounty hunters in this. Boba Fett almost certainly would have been featured. However, back in 2016, Cory Barlog, who was the creative director of the God of War reboot, gave us some interesting tidbits. He worked at Lucasfilm and said he was allowed to go to the ranch and read the scripts for the canceled Star Wars TV show. He said, and I quote, "It was the most mind-blowing thing I'd ever experienced. I cared about the Emperor. They made the Emperor a sympathetic figure who was wronged by this heartless woman. She's this hardcore gangster, and she just totally destroyed him as a person. I almost cried while reading this. This is the Emperor. The lightning out of the fingers Emperor. That's something magical. The writers who worked on that, guys from The Shield in 24, these were excellent writers." I mean, I don't know. That's a bit strange. I don't think I would have liked the Emperor being a man wronged by a woman who turns evil. I much prefer the Emperor just to be a bad hombre. But that's all I've got. Let me know what you think about the news about Star Wars Underworld. Would have been really interesting to see if HBO could have brought this show and George Lucas's vision to life. Think about that article talking about how HBO has really been one of the drivers for American culture. It's crazy to think about that connecting with Star Wars. Anyway, my thoughts, yours down below, please.